and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Russia for meetings with President Putin from that country. What new areas of coordination can these two leaders bring to bilateral ties? In President Trump's latest antics, he has recently posted a video mocking CNN. Can his war against the media and his liberal use of Twitter last another 3 years? Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in his two-day state visit to Russia. Xi and Putin, who boast a close working relationship and intimate personal friendship, have met each other 22 times in 5 consecutive years. In fact, this visit marks the 3rd time this year the two heads of state have met, following meetings during the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Astana. What will this meeting achieve? Take a look at this package.
It is Chinese President Xi Jinping's 6th tour to Russia since taking office. President Xi and his partner Vladimir Putin met in Moscow and agreed to further cement bilateral ties. The two sides agreed to support each other in pursuing their own development path and defending their respective sovereignty and national security. The flourishing and everlasting friendship between Beijing and Moscow also contributes to regional and global peace and prosperity. The China-Russia partnership has played an important role in pushing for peaceful settlements on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and the Syrian civil war.
The visit was fruitful. It has injected new momentum to the China-Russia Comprehensive Coordinated Partnership. President Putin and I both agree that China-Russia ties are at their all-time best. No matter how international circumstances change, our determination and confidence to deepen our strategic coordination won't change.
In the past few years, China has remained Russia's largest trading partner, and Russia is China's major export market for cutting-edge machinery. In the first 5 months, the trade volume increased by 26% to $32.4 billion. China and Russia are comprehensive strategic partners of coordination, and it is quite important for the two to intensify communication and coordination in dealing with major affairs. From Moscow, Xi will fly to Germany, where he will attend the upcoming G20 summit and meet with Russia's President Putin again.
So what is likely to be the significance of this specific trip between the Chinese president and Russian president? And what are likely to be the result of this? Let's turn to our panel. Joining us in our Beijing studio, Professor Wang Yiwei, who is the director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. In Moscow, we have Dmitry Barbish, a political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. And also in Providence, the U.S., we invited Vladimir Goldstein, who is an associate professor of Slavic studies at Brown University. I want to welcome the 3 of you gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Professor Wang, here in Beijing. The latest, of course, is the DPRK ICBM missile test, and that is, according to Pyongyang, a success. So what is going to be the significance of this agreement between the Russian and the Chinese side when the two presidents met, that they agree on bilateral rhetorics toward the parallels that the Chinese talk about, and they also urge the relevant parties to move toward negotiation?
I think it's very significant for President Xi and President Putin to reach the consensus, because the South Korea President Moon Jae-in just visited the United States, also reached this idea. And so China and Russia is 2 permanent members of the United Nations. So we are strongly defend of the non-proliferation and also for the international strategic stability there. So when the North Korea launched the ICBM, this definitely is not just the environment, security environment of the United States and its airlines, right, but the international system.
There are actually 3 layers to this. If I could go to you, Mr. Barbish, in Moscow. One is the two sides have agreed that the parallel suggestion put forward by the Chinese side, one thing is to let DPRK freeze the nuclear and the missile programs. Another thing parallel with this is to let United States and South Korea abstain from doing war games in the region. That's one layer. The second layer of this is both sides urge relevant parties to resume negotiation and try to create peaceful disposition and mutual trust. Third layer of this, agreed by China and Russia, is possibility to have the issue resolved and rule out any military solution. So the three layers very clearly cut out already a framework to resolve the crisis as the world did. Mr. Barbich, what do you think about the significance of these three layers put forward by the two presidents ahead of the G20 summit on the day DPRK launched the ICBM successfully?
Well, I think that I absolutely agree with you that this is a very important statement that both President Xi and President Putin made in Moscow. They basically agree on issues over the North Korean problem. The call for mutual abstainment, I would say, that the United States and South Korea should abstain from new exercises, and North Korea should abstain from missile launches. There is a complete agreement on that between Russia and China. The problem is not in Russia and China. The problem is in the United States, because the rhetoric that we hear from Mr. Trump cannot be called peaceful. Mr. Trump is scolding both China for not applying enough pressure on North Korea and Russia for simply not bowing to American pressure on a lot of other issues. And with this kind of attitude from the United States, of course it's going to be difficult for Russia and China to preserve stability in Southeast Asia, but Russia and China need this stability, and they will achieve it. At the summit in Hamburg, Russia and China will be speaking from the same position, not only on North Korea, but also on Syria, and probably even on Ukraine.
This is a really big warm-up, as we're saying right now, for the G20 summit. If we want to go into details of what the two sides have reached upon, President Xi and Putin agreed to seek a peaceful solution to the Korean Peninsula tension through dialogue and negotiation. You can take a look at some of the specific details over there in those quote on the screen. But let me go to you, Mr. Goldstein. Will the urge from China and the Russian side this time, right before G20, be some words loud and also convincing enough to the other parties, for example, DPRK and particularly the United States?
Well, it's not clear. We don't know yet. The problem is that the President of the United States is somewhat erratic. So we don't know. Now, one day he might hear, another day he might change his mind. What I want to stress is that this meeting between two leaders, Russian and Chinese, comes at a very important moment. It's more or less half a year since President Trump came to power. He showed, both his good sides and bad sides. So now it's important for other major players on the world scene to evaluate it. And I think that was the major thrust of this meeting. So we, Russia and China, we already met 22 times. We know each other very well. Our relationships are good. But there is this free agent. There is this kind of big unknown. So we have to sort of, make it clear as major powers. We have to make it clear that the way to negotiate, the way to the future is through negotiation. To abstain from escalation, abstain from intimidation, abstain from the threats. And what is interesting to stress that South Korea seems to agree with it. That new South Korean leadership trusts Russia. They know that Russia is one of the few countries which have a diplomatic relationship with North Korea. And they say that the Russian approach of de-escalation, of negotiations, is kind of important. So I think the way to convince both sides is to sit down and negotiate. Will they? It remains to be seen. My feeling is that even President Trump might be willing to negotiate. He actually said that he might be willing. But we also have to keep in mind the traditional foreign policy establishment who somehow views North Korea as a rogue state, and they don't want to negotiate.
Professor Wang, here's another thing. Since Professor Goldstein mentioned about the South Korea, rather, right before the visit, President gave an interview to the Intatas news agency in that he specifically mentioned about the United States and South Korea need to work to scrap off and at least stop the installation of the THAAD system. So you see this very dramatic changes of opinions and of positions coming from various parties earlier involved in the six-party talks, and this time certainly with the DPRK, as it said, successfully launched the ICBM, things are going even further to the attention of the world. Professor Wang.
Well, yes, it's very important because the United States, took the excuse of the Iran of the ICBM or other missile, and then have the missile defense system in Eastern Europe. Now the United States did similar things in Eastern Asia, makes the excuse of the North Korea's nuclear and missile threat to hurry up to deployment of the Assad. And that is one of the important is the U.S. Global missile defense system. So the both sides they need each other. That's the
and of course, Chinese and Russians are very nervous about this.
Of course, our environment, security environment, gradually undermined because of the Assad system.
I see.
Of course, also because of the North Korea.
You know, Professor Wang, I want to on that. We see the meeting of the two presidents, Chinese and Russian. Of course, this is already their third time this year, but this is an interesting time right before G20. Meanwhile, Chinese and the American president just made their phone call yesterday, even though there seem to be apparent disagreements about where should be the emphasis of the bilateral relations. China even talked about some of the negative factors in the overall bilateral relations with the United States on that phone call. And this is also, Russia was being accused of meddling with the internal politics of the United States, and certainly has become quite a reluctant player in the overall drama in Washington right now. So, meanwhile, Professor Goldstein mentioned to us, countries in the world looking at the Trump-style leadership is looking at options rather than just American leadership now. So what would all of these factors mixed up together mean for this specific meeting between Russia and China?
That's a very concern of the President Trump. Somebody, even United States sides, are very worried about this. No consistent, coherent policy, foreign policy. They've been more driven by the energy, industries, like the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Accord, and Wall Street. They increase the interest rates of the U.S. dollars, and also by the so-called military technology complex. And then that policy sometimes is not so coherent, and then even sends some wrong, complex signal and even dangerous signals to other partners.
But if I could ask you just directly, you don't have to analyze too much about the United States because we are talking about China-Russia relations. So, Professor
that really,
Wang, directly,
we have the South China.
What does that mean? Is China and Russia getting ever closer to an alliance?
No, I don't think there is.
Or what kind of partnership between these two countries? For our international viewers, this is extremely interesting. Directly answer.
Well, we say the new type of great power relations, China and Russia, non-alliance, not under the target of any third party, and of course it's, but can safeguard the international strategic stability.
I see. Let's go to Mr. Barbish in Russia. Is this partnership going to be sustainable given the political changes in Washington and its impact on the distinctive bilateral relations with Russia and with China?
I think the Russian-Chinese partnership is very sustainable, precisely because the United States and the European Union are becoming so unpredictable. Let me say that, of course, there is not much sense in a military alliance between Russia and China. There would not be much sense if it hadn't been for the policies of the United States towards both Russia and China. the United States is surrounding both Russia and China by military bases. The United States accuses China and Russia of being aggressive states. Okay, right now Russia faces more criticism from the United States than China, but everyone understands that this can change abruptly. And it is not precisely Mr. Trump's fault. These negative tendencies started under Mr. Obama and even before that. So in this situation, the informal alliance between Russia and China is propped up primarily by the unpredictability of the actions of the United States and the European Union. So I believe in the Sino-Russian partnership, not only for economic reasons, but also for the reasons of security.
I see.
As far as economy is concerned, of course it makes sense to have cooperation between Russia and China, because according to the new Silk Road project, we can transport products from China about 3 times faster through the Russian territory and through the territory of the so-called Eurasian Economic Union.
But Mr. Babish,
the United States simply
Mr.
doesn't
Babish,
notice the
I
Eurasian
have to
Economic
jump in
Union.
about that, because you can go on with your answer. I have to jump in on that, sir. What about that? I mean, you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. You also talk about the economic corridor, Eurasian economic corridor proposed by Russia. Some say there has been some parallel between these two ideas. Will they work in partnership, or actually this could be in a way potential conflict between these two countries? That's a very important question. Mr. Babish.
Well, I think it's really an important question, but I think that a conflict right now between Russia and China, or between the United States and our two countries, would be a disaster. So I believe that there will be cooperation between Russia and China in the short perspective, and in the long run the United States will join it. What is needed is just a change in ideology of the United States. Right now the United States is guided by a very aggressive neoliberal ideology. When it changes, there will be complete agreement between all the 3 poles in this triangle.
Well, Professor Goldstein, is Mr. Babish from Russia asking too much, given your knowledge about Washington? Ideology change?
No, I don't think I don't think he's asking too much. I think that's more or less the writing is on the wall. There was a short period of time with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the moment when China was not an economic superpower, when United States could call all the shots, and it was like a unilaterally run war. Now we have new players, and what both Russia and China are united about is they want multifocal world, multilateral world. So they each want to pursue their own line of development, but they want some kind of international bodies, be it United Nations, be it other institutions, who would solve potential conflicts. There is always conflicts in development, but they would solve it diplomatically. They would solve it through traditional means, not by weapons, not by Tomahawk missiles, the way United States got used to during the last 20 or 30 years. But I suspect that this is not has to be all the time, and saner heads in Washington will prevail, and they will readjust their vision. The main thing is that both Russia, China, India, they understand that the world has changed. People in Washington are still kind of secluded, and they see it as it was 20 years ago.
Well, it's very hard to predict where the ideology is going, but for now I do want to ask that question, very specific question, rather than predicting about the future. Professor Wang, China, Russia, the two presidents met, Belt and Road Forum, the SCO summit, now bilateral summit, later G20 summit, later this year BRICS summit, the one of the 5 emerging economies together. They're going to have a summit as well. The two presidents are going to meet there as well. Given these really frequent, really high level, and every time reaching fundamental agreements kinds of exchanges and presidential meetings. What does this mean about the realities of the bilateral relations and the message sending to the rest of the world, it seems?
Firstly, the world is very complex and uncertainty. So China and Russia need to work more close to deal with it, because as the two permanent members of the United Nations, and also the emerging powers, and also developing countries, and so we need to work together to defend the post World War II world order, which the hub of the United Nations. At the same time, also we should jointly to shape a new international order based on the I think the sovereignty, international law, and also global governance. So many issues we should to deal with. SEO mostly focus on security. Now also mutual connectivity and the Belt and Road Initiative. We highlight the principles of the synergies of the strategies with the Euro-Asian Economic Union. So many things we need to talk and coherent.
In fact, according to the common statements coming out of the meeting between the two presidents, there are some words, according to the RT Russia Today: development path, sovereignty, national security, development interests, all of these have to be steadfastly, jointly defended between these two countries. Those are very heavy words, I would say, Mr. Barbish. Your interpretation, briefly.
Well, I think that there is no threat to world stability from Russia and China. Russia and China are acting as the two most responsible actors on the world stage, and these words, I would interpret them as one more proof that there is no threat emanating from Russia and China. Right. There are two countries that want real global trade, that want real cooperation. These are Russia and China, and it's a boon for the world that these two powers that have not been very stable in the past, that now they are one of peace and stability in the world.
Mr. Barbish has always been a cheerleader for China and Russia, certainly. And final words from you, Professor Goldstein, very briefly.
Well, I think, if you allow me some kind of a metaphor, for the last 30 years, United States was a big road surrounded by small cars. And it was responsibility of these small cars to find their way around this track. A truck can go anywhere at whatever speed it wants and do what it wants. Now, with Russia and China and other BRIC countries being big trucks, we need international rules. Who will monitor, some bodies who will, work together and face the multilateral world. And I think it's very important that Russia and China see eye to eye and insist on international rules, international negotiations, and other systems of control rather than unilateral decision and unilateral threats.
Okay, Vladimir Goldstein, Dmitry Barbish. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for shedding some lights about really what are the highlights of the meeting between the Chinese and the Russian presidents. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. Coming up on our program, still to come, as marks the U.S. Independence Day, we take a look at President Trump's unique governing style that has been debated all over the world. Can his war against the mainstream media and his liberal use of social media last another 3 years? The rest. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. Tuesday marks this year's U.S. Independence Day, and 2017 has really witnessed the American people putting into office a president unique from his predecessors, to say the least. President Donald Trump has been different from any other U.S. president, some say, during both his campaign and his presidency. Half a year after becoming U.S. president, he has even labeled himself as, quote, a modern-day president of the United States.
A U.S. president who's different from his predecessors. From the moment Donald Trump declared he would join the presidential election, very few believed he would make it. In the past 50 years, Trump has been the only billionaire-turned president. He made his fortune in construction, but became a household name thanks to his TV series, The Apprentice. He was a public figure who never held political office before becoming US president. During the election campaign, he offended women, Muslim, Hispanic Americans, and the disabled, yet still won the election. He dismissed traditional values cherished by most US politicians. He's not a supporter of globalization, turning his back on US promises on climate deals, challenging the traditional alliance between the US and Europe. However, what really drew the line between Trump and other US presidents is his relationship with the mainstream US media. He derided most media outlets who didn't flatter him during his election campaign. Last week, he accused a host of MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of late National Security Advisor, of quoting him for an interview while bleeding badly from a facelift. His war against CNN has gone to a new level, from calling them fake news to posting a doctored video from a professional wrestling event of him wrestling to the ground a man with a CNN logo for a head. While other US presidents usually made statements through State Department spokespeople or by doing it in person at press conferences, Trump has made full use of social media to announce to the world what's on his mind. Though polls show that more and more Americans are uncomfortable with his Twitter attacks, he defended himself, saying, "My use of social media is not presidential, it's modern-day presidential." However, he's not a happy one.
I loved my previous life. I had so many things going. I actually, this is more work than in my previous life. I thought it would be easier. While I had very little privacy in my old life, because, you know, I've been famous for a long time, this is much less privacy than I've ever seen before.
Well, our two panelists are ready to give their 2 cents on just how unique President Trump's leadership style is and in this day and age. In Beijing, Rick Denham joining us. He is the co-director of Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University and certainly a long-time Washingtonian, being a Washington correspondent in the U.S. Capitol for more than a decade before joining here in China. And also in Washington, D.C., the United States, we have Kurt Volker, who is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO and now CEO of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. I have to say, Ambassador Volker, great haircut for the Independence Day.
I needed it, thank you.
You needed that, and we need some clear thoughts about what this president is really about. Picking up a war with the media, is that a smart thing?
You know, I think the president is going to go about things his own way. He ran his campaign his way, he's going to run his presidency his way. What I think is important is that he's getting the U.S. Focused on some of the major problems we've got internationally, whether it's North Korea or whether it's now dealing with Russia. He'll be meeting with President Putin soon, ISIS, Syria. So I think getting us back on the map in that respect is important. Domestic politics here is something else.
All right. What about the domestic politics in regard to the media? Since you are not, as Ambassador Volker, who used to have a role being an ambassador, so you are, I guess, being part of the media, freer to talk about this. Rick, what's your opinion?
It's a mess. I mean, politics in America is a mess right now. It's very personal. There's almost no civil discourse right now. Legislation is being put together in secret on Capitol Hill. You have a situation where the president has gotten almost no major legislation through a Republican Congress. So it's just a difficult situation.
But you know, Rick, we have to distinguish this. Is this the president's problem, created the problem originally,
right,
or this is the system's problem?
This is an excellent question. I think it was a problem that existed before him. I mean, you look at the 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency, and discourse got coarser and coarser over the time. But Donald Trump has exacerbated it with his very personal attacks, and to some extent, his supporters say there is something called Trump derangement syndrome, that he drives liberals crazy and Democrats crazy. And to an extent, it's true that both sides right now are very mad at the other side. And it's hard to compromise when everybody is just there to destroy the others.
Well, President Trump will certainly label you after hearing your words as one of those liberals, as you have just mentioned.
Or at least media establishment.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But you know, the CNN, of course, has been already in a very clear fight against President Trump. I know, Ambassador Volker, we don't need to go into details about what is happening between the media and the U.S. president, but certainly the media is talking about, in some of its comments and reviews, very formal stories talking about, quote, idiosyncratic and unpredictable American leadership. That, of course, it is talking about the U.S. relationship to the other countries around the world. What do you think about the impact President Trump is having about the nature of U.S. leadership of the world this time?
Well, clearly he's leading his own way. As I said, he has a certain style. You know, it's not the same style as President Obama by a long shot, but he is leading his way. The one thing I would say is that I think there is a distinction between the kind of domestic political environment that our colleague here described and what's happening in foreign affairs. When you go around the world and you look at some of the major trouble spots or issues of concern, whether it's Ukraine and keeping sanctions in place, it's Russia, it's dealing with ISIS, it's Syria, it's the relationship with China, very complicated as it is, dealing with North Korea. I think there you have to say that this administration has pulled itself together and put together some very traditional and some very strong policies. We'll see how that plays out. But I think it's important for foreign leaders to distinguish between the two. What's domestic politics here and what's the U.S. doing on the ground in foreign affairs?
You talk about the DPRK issue. That is certainly an interesting case study in terms of the Trump leadership. Because as you may know, Ambassador Volker, during the last phone call between the two presidents of China and the United States, U.S. keep on emphasizing President Trump, talking about China should having more pressure on the DPRK. Chinese president keep on emphasizing on the overall map of the bilateral relations. So here is the thing, represented by that specific case study. Is this presidency about America first, or is this presidency about America isolation, which is not to work with the others and go the U.S. way no matter what, without considering much of the concern of the others? Ambassador Volker.
Yeah, it's certainly not isolationist. It's certainly not isolationist. I think you have, for example, an op-ed that appeared a few weeks ago from the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, and the head of the National Economic Council, and they made very clear America first doesn't mean America only. It means that when the U.S. engages in the world, and there is tremendous U.S. engagement right now, you've seen the trips to Saudi Arabia, for example, to Israel, emphasis on an Israel-Palestinian settlement. We talked about Syria, North Korea. There's a lot of engagement. The emphasis coming from the president, however, is, in his view, past engagement was not successful, and he aims to be successful, and so he wants to make sure that the deals that we strike, the things that we do, really do advance America's interests. That's where he's getting at saying America first.
All right. Here is a fundamental debate, isn't it, gentlemen, about what exactly is the fundamental interest of the United States when it comes to foreign relations and when it comes to the role of the U.S. presidency. Mr. Dunham, I want to go to you about that. I mean, when you look at the Middle East, the U.S. president made a trip to Israel. There have been some going back to the traditional U.S. working together, Republican Party kind of, with Israel. But then there's also the Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Qatar issue, both of which the U.S. probably have to work with for the future, right after President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. And then here in Asia, this DPRK issue not resolving itself yet. And it seems that the Taiwan issue is picking up with the arms sales. You could argue it's a routine, but still creates some stir over here in this region, not to mention some of the other parts of the world. So Mr. Dunham, I want some specific answers from you. What about the nature of this presidency?
Well, I think, as Ambassador Volker said, the team is pretty stable, but I think it has a high degree of instability. I think we see the president going from one side to another on issues, and the situation in North Korea, we have seen him go from being very positive about working with China to now basically saying go it alone. I mean, I think the biggest case study is Saudi Arabia. After he visits Saudi Arabia, you have a new crown prince. You have a very hawkish position of Saudi Arabia. You have trying to put sanctions on Qatar, and you've just seen changes in the world as a result of what he has done. I would like to see more consistency. I think the team in place, particularly National Security Advisor McMaster, is grown up and is consistent. But I think the president, from tweet to tweet, changes his position, and his own administration has to adjust to it.
But you know, some would, Ambassador Volker, argue that is exactly the leadership style that President Trump wants to have. That is about the deal-based diplomacy. I want the immediate satisfaction, immediate result according to what I wanted. Is that the way to go? Many would ask that question. Your view here, Ambassador Volker.
Well, you know, I can only speculate, but I think my guess is the reason the president likes to tweet is because it's a way for him to communicate directly. The other ways that presidents have traditionally communicated are very, very scripted, and he wants to convey to his own base of supporters his own personality, his own style. And so I think that's what he's trying to do. As our other colleague here said, that is sometimes coming at a different angle from where the position of the administration has settled on a policy matter. And yes, there's some confusion as a result of that, but it's also a way of political communication.
Yeah.
But then it has been gelled. So take, for example, the Saudi Arabia example that he gave. That's exactly right, how that played out. As a result of that, this issue was then pulled together and consolidated in the administration, handed to Secretary Tillerson, and said, okay, now this is yours, you go work this out.
What are you saying, Ambassador Volker? You seem to suggest there seems to be already a process in a way out of this chaos that the president sent a tweet, everybody react, out of this chaos, send it over to the people in the administration responsible to handle those issues. Is that what you're saying, Ambassador Volker? Is there a pattern already?
I think there's a growing process. Yeah, I think it's growing. The administration, I think, started really without many processes in place. Didn't have a lot of people in place. And we're now 6 months in, and you are starting to see that some of these processes are starting to gel. There are more people there. They've had a bit more experience working with each other, and so that is starting to work a bit.
Right. Mr. Dunham, though, as Ambassador Volker mentioned, the putting together already and the functioning of that team is already, in a way, going further than it previously was. But the question is, what kind of style of governance is this? Mr. Dunham, you've been here in China for quite some time. You see the changes according to the Chinese perspective, the world. Right. And you see the perspective from the others as well as they are coming into China and out. Can the U.S. still go that way as it originally was? So this kind of deal-based foreign policy, immediate result for the United States, can it be delivered?
Well, excellent question. I think it all starts with President Trump and his demeanor. He coined the phrase modern-day presidential, that he's not a traditional presidential president. He does it his own way. And I do think that a lot of foreign policy will be, as you were suggesting, more transactional. It will go to his business background, his personality style. He likes one-on-one personal relationships. He likes to cut deals. And if somebody hits him, as his administration says time and time again, he'll hit back 10 times as hard. So, I mean, with North Korea, I could see one of two things. I could see a deal, a big deal, a historical deal, or I could see him hitting back with 10 times as big a weapon as Kim Jong-un is shipping up into the sky.
Right. Well, Mr. Dunn, I have to say you are a great journalist to keep on taking notes of all the phrases being used over time. But before we go, I do want to come back to you, Ambassador Volker, about this. I mean, American leadership since World War II was quite clear, particularly right after the end of the Cold War. But things have evolved. The world has changed. So what style of American leadership is needed and will be respected? It's a big question.
Well, I think we've seen changes already over time. I think you really have to go back to President Bush George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama, and now President Trump. We've seen very different presidents, very different styles over about 20 years now. And I think what works best and what's necessary is when you have American strength, so political, economic, values, and military, and that we are able to exercise leadership around those values and interests together with others, that we are a country that can attract others and then can build coalitions. If we do that and do it well, I think we can have a lot of success still in the world. It's when we go it alone too much or we pull back, and those are some of the tragedies of the past, things do tend to go off the rails. And so getting that balance right is something that we have yet to do.
President Trump now in Poland, they're trying to figure out the national security kind of thing with his NATO partners. Later in Germany, in Hamburg, talking about the overall relationship with the rest of the world. I'm sure climate change issue will be mentioned once and again, but a lot of interesting information on the Independence Day discussion. Quite heavy, food for thought. Thank you so much, Ambassador Kurt Volker and Rick Dunn.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. So from me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.